The history of popular music in the 20th century is marked by various movements that sought to redefine the boundaries of what a song could be. But perhaps no movement was as ambitious, complex, and artistically audacious as progressive rock, often abbreviated simply as prog rock. This subgenre emerged from the fertile ground of the late 1960s, a period characterized by psychedelic exploration and a burgeoning desire among musicians to elevate rock music to the status of high art. Progressive rock flourished magnificently during the first half of the 1970s, representing a defiant departure from the 3-minute pop song and the constraints of standard radio formatting. It was a movement that embraced expansive musical structures, intricate instrumentation, a high degree of technical virtuosity, and deeply elaborated lyrical concepts. By fusing elements of rock with classical music, jazz, folk, and avant-garde experimentation, progressive rock created a sonic landscape that was both intellectually demanding and emotionally immersive. Iconic bands such as Pink Floyd, Yes, Genesis, King Crimson, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Jethro Tull, and Gentle Giant became the standard bearers of this golden era, producing conceptual albums that were not merely collections of songs, but cohesive, multi-layered journeys. These works required attentive, dedicated listening, offering a rich aesthetic experience that mirrored the complexities of the era itself. However, as the mid-1970s approached, a perceptible shift began to occur. By the years 1975 and 1976, the momentum that had propelled progressive rock to the top of the charts and the forefront of cultural relevance began to falter. This decline was not the result of a single, isolated event, but rather a perfect storm of converging pressures: economic, market-driven, artistic, and socio-cultural, that collectively forced the genre from its position of dominance. To understand the sunset of this golden age, one must first examine the rise of the commercial imperative, a shift in the music industry's soul that can be succinctly summarized by the mantra, "Let's make money." In its purest and most uncompromising form, progressive rock was an expensive undertaking. The creation of a classic prog album often required months of expensive studio time, the hiring of highly skilled musicians and session players, the inclusion of complex orchestrations involving choirs or full orchestras, and the production of elaborate gatefold album covers with detailed liner notes and artwork. Furthermore, the live performances associated with the genre were logistically daunting, involving massive amounts of sophisticated sound and lighting equipment, innovative stage designs, and long, grueling tours. In the early years of the 1970s, record labels were riding a wave of unexpected commercial success following the psychedelic era. This prosperity, combined with a prevailing culture of experimentation, allowed executives to grant bands a considerable degree of creative freedom. They were willing to act as reluctant patrons of the arts, trusting that the artist's vision would eventually find an audience. However, as the 1970s progressed, the music industry underwent a process of rapid consolidation. Small, independent labels were acquired by large multinational conglomerates, and the business model shifted toward a focus on mass-market profit and immediate returns. The pressure to produce radio-friendly hits and achieve massive sales figures increased exponentially. Long-form compositions, often featuring odd time signatures, obscure lyrical themes, and extended instrumental passages, were inherently ill-suited for the emerging AM/FM radio landscape, which was becoming the primary driver of commercial success. Musicians and bands found themselves caught in a profound dilemma. They could either maintain their artistic integrity and risk becoming commercially non-viable, or they could adapt their sound to reach a wider audience and ensure their financial survival. For some, this adaptation was a pragmatic necessity, born of the need to pay bills and sustain a career. For others, the allure of greater fortune played a role. The realization grew that while the progressive rock niche was incredibly dedicated, it was numerically limited compared to the vast market potential of straightforward pop rock, hard rock, or the burgeoning disco movement. Consequently, many emblematic prog bands began to incorporate more accessible elements into their music, shortening their songs, simplifying their structures, and adopting more palatable, universal themes. While this move brought some bands newfound chart success and a different audience, it inevitably alienated a portion of their original fan base and signaled a dilution of the progressive essence. This commercialization was intrinsically linked to a transformation in market dynamics and the fundamental stance of the record labels themselves. The era when labels functioned as patrons of innovation was being replaced by an era of extreme risk aversion. The recording industry was becoming a massive corporate machine where artistic decisions were increasingly dictated by A&R, artists and repertoire, executives and marketing strategists rather than the musicians themselves. This new corporate patron did not prioritize artistic innovation or musical complexity. Instead, it demanded a reliable return on investment. The industry began to favor musical products that could be easily packaged, promoted, and consumed on a mass scale. In this environment, progressive rock became a less attractive investment. The genre's long gestation periods between albums and its refusal to conform to the 3-minute single format made it a liability in the eyes of corporate bean counters. New bands that sought to explore progressive sounds found it nearly impossible to secure recording contracts, as the industry's infrastructure was no longer designed to support them. Even established giants of the genre faced immense internal pressure to simplify their sound. Historic labels that were once synonymous with progressive exploration, such as Charisma or Vertigo, began to diversify their catalogs, shifting their priorities toward artists with broader commercial appeal. This withdrawal of industry support, the increasing difficulty in producing, recording, and distributing progressive works, was a decisive factor in the genre's marginalization. By the late 1970s, progressive rock had been largely pushed out of the musical mainstream, forced to survive on independent labels or within a more specialized underground circuit supported by a loyal but smaller audience. Beyond these external market forces, the genre also faced an internal creative crisis. It is a natural cycle in any artistic movement that a period of intense innovation and experimentation is eventually followed by a plateau or a loss of creative vigor. After nearly a decade of pushing boundaries, many of the primary bands in the progressive movement began to show signs of exhaustion. The challenge of constantly maintaining a level of extreme complexity, originality, and ambition is immense. Some groups likely felt that they had explored every possible permutation of their style, leading to a repetition of established formulas or misguided attempts at reinvention that failed to capture the spark of their earlier work. Furthermore, the grueling cycles of recording and touring took a heavy physical and mental toll on the musicians. Internal conflicts, frequent lineup changes, and disagreements over the future musical direction of the bands became more common. When comparing the albums produced during the peak of the movement to those released after 1975, a trend toward settling and simplification becomes evident. While the earlier works were defined by their boldness and a sense of limitless exploration, the later albums often reflected a search for relevance in a changing world. A search that sometimes resulted in music that felt forced or uninspired. While there were certainly notable exceptions, bands that continued to produce high-quality, complex work The general consensus among critics and fans was that the creative peak of the movement had passed. Some artists managed to navigate this transition with grace, finding ways to blend progressive elements with newer styles, but others struggled, producing works that seemed like pale shadows of their former achievements. This internal loss of creative momentum, when coupled with the mounting pressures of a hostile market, contributed significantly to the public perception of the genre's decline. Perhaps the most complex and difficult factor to quantify, yet arguably the most pervasive, was the shift in public taste. A phenomenon sometimes described as the pauperization or impoverishment of taste. This was not merely a musical shift, but a broader socio-cultural transformation. In the second half of the 1970s, mass audiences began to demonstrate a dwindling patience for the intellectual demands and long-form storytelling inherent in progressive rock. This era witnessed the explosive rise of two musical movements that were radically different in their philosophy and execution: punk rock and disco. Punk rock, with its raw energy, nihilistic attitude, and deliberate instrumental simplicity, represented a visceral rejection of everything progressive rock stood for. To the punk generation, the virtuosity and intellectualism of prog were seen as pretentious, elitist, and detached from the harsh realities of everyday life. Punk offered an immediate catharsis, a direct connection to the frustration and anger of a youth facing economic uncertainty and social disillusionment. It championed a do-it-yourself philosophy that empowered anyone to pick up an instrument and express themselves, contrasting sharply with the years of training and technical mastery required for progressive rock. Simultaneously, disco music offered a different kind of alternative: pure escapism. With its steady, danceable beats and lush arrangements, disco focused on the hedonistic pleasure of the dance floor rather than the cerebral engagement of a concept album. While punk and disco were musical opposites, they shared an immediacy and accessibility that progressive rock lacked. The general public seemed to crave either the raw, challenging energy of the street or the rhythmic shimmer of the club, leaving little room in the cultural center for 20-minute instrumental suites and complex philosophical themes. This period suggested a transition from a demand for artistic depth and quality toward a preference for quantity and repetition. The easily memorized, the danceable, and the catchy became the dominant currencies of the popular music market. In this climate of simplification and the search for immediate gratification, the investment of time and attention required by progressive rock became a barrier to entry for the masses, further relegating the genre to a specialized audience. It is crucial to recognize that these four primary factors — growing commercialism, the lack of industry support, the internal creative crisis, and the shift in public taste — did not operate in a vacuum. They formed a self-reinforcing, vicious cycle. Commercial pressure and the scarcity of market opportunities drove bands toward simplification or dissolution, which in turn fueled the perception of a creative decline. The rise of punk and disco was both a reflection of and a catalyst for the changing taste of the public, making the environment even more inhospitable for progressive sounds. The loss of creative vigor in some bands provided record labels with the justification they needed to withdraw their investment. Greed and the sheer necessity of financial survival pushed some musicians away from their progressive roots and toward more lucrative, commercial pastures. Together, these elements orchestrated the retreat of historic progressive rock from the spotlight. However, as we reflect on this history, it is essential to clarify that while the specific historical movement of the early 1970s may have receded, the genre itself never truly died. It retreated to the margins. where it was nurtured by a devoted community of fans and musicians who refused to let the flame of ambition expire. In the 1980s, a new generation of musicians emerged to create what became known as neo-prog. Bands like Marillion, IQ, and Pendragon revitalized the aesthetic elements of classic prog, the keyboards, the narrative lyrics, the complex structures, and adapted them for a new decade. Later, the spirit of progressive rock fused with the power of heavy metal, giving birth to progressive metal, a subgenre that achieved immense popularity through bands like Dream Theater, Tool, and Opeth. These groups proved that technical dazzling and conceptual depth still had a place in the musical world. Furthermore, the influence of the golden era of progressive rock can be felt across a vast spectrum of contemporary music, from alternative and indie rock to various strands of electronic music. It remains a vital reference point for any artist who seeks to go beyond the conventional structures of pop and explore the outer limits of sound. The resilient presence of progressive ideas in today's musical landscape demonstrates that the quest for exploration and innovation is a permanent part of the human spirit. In conclusion, the decline of the golden age of progressive rock in the mid-1970s was a multifaceted event, a result of a complex interplay between the let's make money ethos of a consolidating industry, the risk aversion of corporate labels, the natural creative fatigue of pioneering artists, and a profound shift in the cultural appetite toward simplicity and immediacy. While these forces conspired to remove progressive rock from its throne in the mainstream, they could not erase its legacy. The music created during that peak era continues to be revered for its beauty, its complexity, and its uncompromising ambition. Its echoes continue to inspire new generations of musicians who dare to challenge the boundaries of what music can be, proving that while the historical form may have moved out of the spotlight, the progressive spirit of exploration remains an essential and vital force in the ever-evolving story of human creativity. The progressive rock of the 1970s was a testament to the idea that music could be more than just background noise or a temporary distraction. It could be a profound intellectual and emotional experience, a mirror of the human condition in all its complexity. That ideal remains as relevant today as it was when the first notes of a mellotron echoed through a studio decades ago.